by FantasyInsiders.com. Dan Strafford, Joe DeSalvo, Ben Pritchett with you on this Thursday night. And apparently we're starting off by smoking some crack here on the Fantasy Insiders College Football Show, according to Ben. At least our watchers are. So, Ben, Joe, welcome here on this Thursday, week 12 of the college football season. Amazing how we are belly up against Thanksgiving next week. A very busy week for college football. Programming note, we are going to take the week off. We're going to give thanks to our families for dealing with us doing shows such as this. And I know Joe and Ben, with their research week over week, the wives, the kids, they deserve a little extra dad time. So we're going to get that in next week and then get back to you guys after that. But Ben, we come into this week, and I know there's some different slates to talk about here, but we have some injuries mounting to some of the top options at a variety of positions with Booker and Doxson and guys who we've leaned on, maybe not Booker as much, but leaned on throughout the season. How do we continue to target these teams with their second and third tier guys up, or do we just start to look elsewhere because there's so many options in college football?
Yeah, I think Devontae Booker is kind of a relatively new thing. I don't know if everybody knows that, but Devontae Booker, unbeknownst to anybody, tore his meniscus and is beat up and is going to be out for the rest of the year. So next guy up is going to be Joe Williams. It's important to keep track of all these injuries and everything as we're getting to the end of the season. And you have teams that are falling out of contention and don't really have anything to play for. And you have freshmen that might get more playing time than they might have otherwise gotten and things like that you're really going to have to pay attention to. And you'll have to read the write-up and listen to Joe and his rankings and things to find the jewels as they rise to the surface. When you're talking about like the TCU situation, Boykin might miss that game. Doxson might miss that game. This is more Joe's expertise, but when it comes to value, I mean, if you get Foster Sawyer playing the quarterback for TCU as a value play, I mean, he's super cheap on DraftKings. So you have to be monitoring these situations. That's a late game. So it's one that you're going to have to stay tuned to all day Saturday, unfortunately. But there's plenty of these that we're going to deal with in the early slate too. Joe, do you have any that you've written down that you might think we might need to talk about?
Well, I just think as far as injuries goes, I mean, obviously you still we didn't even mention Greg Ward with Houston, who's I think Houston's on one. I don't know if it's on FanDuel, DraftKings. I don't know if it's on the other. I think that might be the big one there. Other than that, I think when you just talk about injuries, maybe Trey Madden for USC's questionable. I think that affects the status of Ronald Jones. Obviously, that boosts his stock up as well. And I think we already touched on the big ones. I think there's just some questions. You know, what do you do at Notre Dame with CJ Prosise? He's supposed to be back. Josh Adams has had 2 great games in a row. There's just a lot of things to consider this week. And I think there's more injuries this week than we've talked about in just the last maybe 2 or 3.
Yeah, and also I'd add Wayne Gallman is a big question mark for Clemson. And that's a huge one because on DraftKings, Zach Brooks is only $3K.
Zach Brooks.
And then you have Wes Brown, who took over the starting tailback job for Maryland, is now suspended indefinitely. So Brandon Ross, who's 3.3K on DraftKings, becomes an option against Indiana. So these cheap guys, Joe Williams, who's 3K, which would take over for Booker. I mean, those guys are going to be the fill-in players that you love and you want. It looks like we got just a plethora of options as running backs.
Let's, we obviously know that the season is dwindling down. Ben touched on the fact that a lot of these teams are playing for, let's be honest, 3 and 7 teams are still playing for bowl eligibility because there are 41 bowl games. They need 82 teams. And I know this has been a running joke, but a team like Rutgers, somehow or another, if they win out, could be going to a bowl game, no matter how dreadful they've been, and that's the landscape of college football right now. So playing for something, playing for pride.
Are there really 41 bowl games?
Yes, sir.
Holy smokes. Did they add bowl games? There hasn't always been 41.
There were 39 last year, I think. I think they added 2 more. It's terrible. It's an awful situation that has just been an absolute cash grab, and they continue to roll out there. And I wouldn't be surprised if Fantasy Insiders is sponsoring one in the not-so-distant future. That's how many of them there are.
I'm down. I want the Bahamas Bowl.
Yeah, exactly. There's one in Detroit. I mean, let's be honest.
I don't want that one. Don't want that one. Come on,
So
that one better be half off. It's a Black
probably,
Friday deal to sponsor that one.
So there are a lot of teams still playing for something now. It might be a bowl against a fifth tier or sixth tier Big 12 team, but that is the case nonetheless. So we'll keep an eye on all of this, and there are injuries, and there are a lot of coaching vacancies too, and this is all sort of narrative stuff that plays into how these teams play, but all things to be kept an eye on, and over at the CFF site, the news stream over there, and during Ben's write-up, you'll find a lot of notes there. And just a programming, I guess, more content note. Don't forget, we have Jordan Case's content up on fantasyinsiders.com, which he has dubbed dumpster diving, but where he really tries to look into the cheaper Minsal and cheaper guys who could far exceed their price tags, which is complementary to Ben's late and early write-ups each and every week. So, gentlemen, let's dive into this slate, the early slate of games. Ben, we are, again, fairly similar lineups between the two sites, but we do have some differences here and there. What games are you targeting in your write-up? Which ones do you think are going to yield the biggest results here at the top as we dive into plays at individual positions next?
Okay, so we'll just run through kind of like we did last week. I had a lot of positive feedback for how we kind of handled things last week, so I'm going to be a little bit more thorough than we have been. With the highest totals we have, USC at Oregon. It's a 71.5 with Oregon favored by 4.5 when I wrote these down. That's a game you definitely want to look at. I actually am kind of riding the USC side of things. I noticed people on Twitter and other places are starting to tout Vernon Adams. Not quite ready to go there, but I like a lot of the USC options in this game as they're kind of playing for Clay Helton to kind of take this job, which I think he will actually wind up taking this job as an interim, which is unbelievable for USC to do. But I think they should do it. I think he's a good coach from what I've been reading. UNC at Virginia Tech, 61.5. You got Memphis at Temple, which is remarkably a 63 total with Memphis favored by 1. I just think that that's an incredible high total for that game, and it's a credit to how potent Memphis's offense can be that they think that they could even score a little bit on Temple. Indiana at Maryland, 64. Western Kentucky FIU game, which is only on DraftKings, so is the Indiana-Maryland game. That's a 66. It's definitely one you want to target. Both sides. We'll kind of dig into those specific plays that we like, but definitely I like Clemson guys. Not necessarily a huge total. I think it's only 48 at the moment, but Clemson's favored by 29. So they basically think Clemson's going to score all the points. With Wayne Gallman out of the game, you're going to see guys that might get chances. Definitely some diamonds in the rough that might be cheaper. Iowa's kind of in the same boat. Houston, UConn, and Arizona State are the two games that don't have lines because, like Joe mentioned with Greg Ward, we don't know if he's going to play. If Greg Ward plays, we'll talk about him when we get into quarterbacks. He just changes the whole atmosphere of that entire game. So if he's in, then everything changes, and Vegas knows that, so they're not even bothering with it at the moment until we get some clarity. I doubt they even list a line on that one. Arizona State. People were talking about Anu Solomon and the viability of how he shifts the line. I really don't think Vegas cares if Anu Solomon is the quarterback or not. I really don't think. I think it was all revolving around Nick Wilson. And is he going to play? He wasn't listed on the injury report, but I saw somebody talk about that even when he's not listed, they don't list their doubtful guys on the injury report.
Right.
And he left the last game with an injury. And so they were actually, I might even be in the DraftKings blurb, was talking about that might they would lean more towards him being doubtful than playing. So both those guys are out. Arizona could be in just all kinds of problems. Scooby Wright's definitely out. So don't expect a whole lot from them, and Arizona State could just roll right over them in that rivalry game.
Joe, how about yourself? What games are you paying attention to, either from a season-long perspective or even at this point in the year, games that you're intrigued to watch from just a college football perspective?
I'll just stick with some of the games that are on the slate, and just one he never touched on that I think could be interesting is the Michigan State-Ohio State game. I think there could be some points in that game. Neither team has shown that they have any type of a shutdown defense this year. I think there could be a lot of points in that game when you're talking about Burbridge. You're looking now at Gerald Holmes at running back. As long as Connor Cook plays, you got Barrett, you've got Ezekiel Elliott. I think there's a number of options in that game as well. And like Ben said, I think, man, so much your lineup can depend so much on what may happen with Greg Ward. I'm almost thinking right now, if I'm creating a lineup, I almost want Greg Ward to sit right now and maybe jumping on Kyle Postma at about 6,300 on DraftKings right now, because I think the more questions you have, the more uncertainty is around your lineup. And for a lot of season-long folks, and I'll touch on a game that's not on the slate, but, there's a big running back, Ray Laurie, at Old Dominion that got ruled out earlier this week. Well, his backup becomes an immediate play in season-long. I almost think when a play is ruled out early, it becomes an advantage for us because we can make more of a specific determination earlier in the week instead of taking things at the kickoff.
Ben, what do you make out of the situation as we look at games and the past 2 weeks? You mentioned Jake Ruddick in the past, and we can sort of make our way into quarterback here discussing it. This is a guy who went up against two awful secondaries week over week, but seems to be slowly coming into his own. Looking at sort of high-level statistics for a team like Penn State on the year, who Ruddick faces next, it doesn't seem like they're giving up a ton of yardage on the pass or the run. It seems like their defense is in a pretty good spot this year as they go on. But how much is that opponent dependent, and how much is that how good this Penn State defense is? And are you riding sort of a Ruddick hot streak here at a cheaper price tag? Or that's what I assumed. Or are you assuming some regression back to who he actually is as a quarterback?
Yeah, so Jim Harbaugh, speaking of smoking crack, he was talking about Jake Rudock like he was the top quarterback in the country just recently because he's had two really good games, but he's faced Indiana and Rutgers. I'm not 100% sure that I couldn't have two really good games against Indiana and Rutgers. Let's just be honest. We're talking about two of the most pathetic pass defenses in college football. So let's not just get carried away. I mean, he's going to be playing at Penn State in this game. Like, to think that he even has a shot of being good is just insane to me. But even if he does, his price has gone up. There's just no upside to thinking about using him. If you're looking for a cheap quarterback, there are guys that I like on DraftKings. There's nothing I really like on FanDuel, and that's a shame. Normally we can find like a guy in the 6K range that you can swoop in and get. Maybe Gerard Randall if Anu Solomon's out. But even that is kind of pushing it because of how good Arizona State's run defense has been. I think they're in the top 30 or so against the run. Randall doesn't offer much against in the pass department, so he's kind of not worth it on FanDuel where you have a little bit more flexibility. Like Nate Sudfeld, who's kind of the same. He's a better quarterback than Ruddick. And he's facing at Maryland. Maryland's run defense is way better than I have given them credit for all season. Their pass defense is not very good. So I would not be surprised to see Sudfeld have a nice game on the road. He's only 5,100 on DraftKings, so he's about as cheap as they come. So definitely one I'm looking at. I like Alex McGough, FIU, facing Western Kentucky at home. He's been a little up and down. But the game has a 66 total like we talked about. And I think Western, what are they favored by? 16.5. That's a pretty tight game enough. It's tight enough to where I think if Western gets out in front, you could see McGough throw a little bit and move a little bit. He gets occasional rushing touchdowns, but he doesn't run a lot. If that makes any sense. It's sometimes quarterbacks are like that. He's not necessarily a run threat.
Tom Brady.
But Tom Brady. Yeah. A guy that maybe gets you down to the one and then runs it in. But I'm not really looking at those guys on FanDuel. You're going to be going back to the high-priced dudes. He mentioned the Ohio State-Michigan State game. For that game, I'm looking at JT Barrett. That's where you start when you're looking at this game. In this same matchup last year, he threw for 300 yards and 3 touchdowns and rushed for another 86 and 2 touchdowns. Not saying this is the same exact situation, but that Michigan State defense last year was way better than it is this year. And while they have been very good against the run, they have been pathetic against the pass for a Michigan State team. And so I would not be surprised if Barrett and Thomas, the wide receiver Michael Thomas, has really, really nice games. I would rather attack the Ohio State playing at home that kind of way than I would necessarily go for the Spartans players. Marquise Williams, North Carolina at Virginia Tech is going to be the more under the radar play. I think actually Fish might be more on Marquise Williams than sharp people. And that's just because he's been hot. He's had 2 really good games in a row. And North Carolina is arguably the hottest offense in college football at the moment. So people are going to just automatically gravitate towards him as a play. Surface level, though, the sharps will look at Virginia Tech and think, well, that's a good defense. Not necessarily the case. They struggle against quarterbacks that can run. They gave up 169 yards and 2 touchdowns to James Summers of ECU. They gave up over 100 yards to Thomas Sirk, if I'm not mistaken, in running, and he threw for 270 yards and 4 touchdowns against them as well. Marquise Williams is much better than both those dudes, and he's playing way better than both those guys. So he's definitely in play on both sites. He's very expensive on DraftKings, so you kind of have to nail it. We talked about Greg Ward. Greg Ward, if he plays, if I know he's playing and we don't have any question marks, like Joe said, he's wanting the opposite. He wants his backup to play. For me, I want Greg Ward to play. And this is why. I look at UConn. I see Keenan Reynolds rush for 142 yards and 3 touchdowns in a triple option set. But Quentin Flowers rushed for 98 yards and 2 touchdowns. Or he threw for 2 touchdowns and he rushed for another touchdown. So this is another team that struggles against running quarterbacks. And Greg Ward's the best running quarterback in college football at the moment. So I love him. I love this guy. People are going to look at Brandon Doty. I think he's an option. I'm a little bit timid on using him on DraftKings just because he's so expensive, and we have these other guys that I mentioned about the same price tag. So even though you're lured in with that thought that maybe Doty can throw for 6 touchdowns, I don't think he does it. I think he throws for maybe 303, which is great, but it's kind of more of a cash game level type upside. I don't see his upside being quite the level of Ward or Williams or even Barrett. So those are the high price guys. We'll just go over, since we're going to run out of time if I go through these like this, but Berkovich for Arizona State against Arizona. I like that matchup a lot in a game that I think that they should dominate. Skylar Howard, West Virginia against Kansas. At Kansas, big deal. Don't care. West Virginia should run all over them. Even if they don't, even if that game stays tight, or West Virginia opts to just run the ball a lot like they have been doing lately and letting Howard not throw the ball a lot, I still think Howard does enough to pay off a $6,900 FanDuel price. He's more of a GPP style quarterback because he has enormous upside, but actually does have a low floor where he could not do a whole lot. And then Cody Kessler would be the only other guy I would really, really seriously look at. We talked about we should probably also talk about Perry Hills, but I'll let Joe talk about Perry Hills.
Good, because that was about the only one on my list that you haven't touched on yet. So I'll just start with him. For him to be 6,500 on DraftKings, he had 3 straight great games over 100 yards. He struggled recently in his most recent 2 games, but I think for him to be going up against an Indiana defense that's just giving up an ungodly amount of yards, to get him for 6,500 when he's got a chance to run for at least 100 yards is great value. The one thing that I will say about Greg Ward, though, Ben, is that we see him with some of these injuries, especially ankle injuries, on guys whether or not they can be explosive. And these runners like Greg Ward, like the Jordan Kinsary, like LaShawn Daniels earlier, when they go out there, it's hard for them to recover quickly. That's why I like a guy like Postma. I'd like to see Greg Ward sit because I'm jumping all over Postma. I like him on both sides. You did mention McGough for FIU as well. I did like him going against Western Kentucky for 5,400. And, Nate Sedfeld, you mentioned at 5,100 for Indiana. And the reason why I think he's so low is, look, the Hoosiers, Jordan Howard's just carrying them now. I mean, they have basically put that offense on the back of Jordan Howard. And you know what? I do like, and I will play devil's advocate a little bit, I do like Vernon Adams for 7,700 on FanDuel, and I do like Skylar Howard, like you mentioned, 6,900 going against Kansas as well. So those are a few names of some of the mid-tier guys that I like over there on both sites in the early slate.
Let's turn the page to running back, as you guys are giving out great information here. Keep that train moving forward. We talked about Ohio State against Michigan State, Zeke Elliott at 9,300 on FanDuel. You have Leonard Fournette, Royce Freeman, all these guys at the top. But touching on Houston here, Ben, and talking about Ward, we know that Kenneth Farrow at 7,400 on FanDuel. Posma is also a dual threat QB. Does Farrow get any plus or minus in your book if Ward can or cannot go, or is it sort of status quo for Farrow, independent of who is their quarterback.
Yeah, I mentioned this I wrote up Farrow. So I mentioned it in the write up for him that while he's a lock for touchdowns, which is why we like him, he's not necessarily a lock for a lot of rushing yards. And so that's kind of where I think that if Greg Ward is out, it helps Farrow in the sense that I think he gets maybe more yardage than he normally does. UConn's giving up 4.6 yards per carry and 171 yards per game on the ground. I have a feeling that they would lean more heavily on Farrow than they would Posma in that situation where Ward was out. But I do, so I would say that it benefits Farrow more if Ward is out. But normally I like running quarterbacks and how they open up running backs in college football. It usually helps them more than it hurts them.
The read option obviously has become pretty standard across college football when you have a running quarterback and more lanes open up and more opportunities seem to open up. Well, when that's the case, obviously more of a focus on the run when you have a read option QB. So Joe, we'll start with you here. Let Ben sit back a little bit and get ready to go. But who's your top option as a running back on either site on Saturday's slate?
Well, look, the top option, if I'm looking at DraftKings, which I'm open right now, and I went over both sides, so you've got Leonard Fournette sitting there at 8,600. But like I mentioned right now, the Indiana offense runs through Jordan Howard right now. With Devontae Booker out being at 8,200, I think Jordan Howard right now is the top option at 8K. Right there for Indiana. So with that being said, he's my top option in regards to running back. I will touch on Farrow. I do think if Greg Ward is out, that Farrow becomes a really good play. I've got him written down on both sites, whether it's 6,400 DraftKings or 7,400 FanDuel. I think he's good value on both sites. And then I'll just go with some of my value guys because I think we all know the top names. I think after what Arkansas and Alabama did to LSU on the ground, I think somebody like Jalen Walton for 4,100 for Ole Miss has tremendous value against LSU this weekend. I think Wendell Smallwood, given what teams are doing on the ground against Kansas, we've touted Smallwood all year. There's no reason to get away from him now in a game against Kansas. To be 7,600 on FanDuel, I think is great value. I think Ronald Jones right now, you're looking at Trey Madden for USC being out of the game this week. That eliminates one of the running backs of the three-headed monster right there. And I think his carries go up. His value is incredible. And I still think Gerald Holmes is underpriced for Michigan State at 5,200 on FanDuel. Ben already touched on Zach Brooks and a lot of the replacement running backs. And then another name maybe at 3,200 for Georgia Tech would be a guy like Marcus Allen who came on last week. And maybe this is a case where Georgia Tech rides the hot hand. And for 3,200 against Miami, I think he's got tremendous value for Georgia Tech in the early slate.
I will say, Allen, written up in Jordan's dumpster diving column, that is a tease for you. So you know one of the names in there, but you can check out the rest if you're not yet a member of Fantasy Insiders. It's fantasyinsiders.com/plans. Appreciate all the work Joe and Ben do here. Ben does the write-ups over on FI, so you can get the early and late slate write-ups from Benjamin himself. Now, some interesting lack of games between the two sites here, who's available, who's not available. So from a running back position, it seems a little bit more prevalent than from the quarterback position. I do want to point out, and this is just something I've seen happen to some people who are not college football players and maybe not some of the guys here and watching this, make sure you're picking the right person you're talking about. I mean this with Jordan Howard, right? So there are multiple Jordan Howards who play college football. If you see that in the write-up, make sure you're picking the right one and that you're doing the diligence you need to do to make sure you're not plugging and playing someone just because their name. College football has a lot of Smiths and Howards, and so just take the time to make sure you're on the right site and you're doing this research the proper way. Just want to put that out there because it happens. There's somebody in the FI chat who does it more often than others, but we just want a PSA there for you guys. Ben, how about yourself? Running back, you've touched on a lot of guys already. Joe's hit on a lot as well. Is there one who stands out for you as the top option, or do you have sort of a mix and match, high price, low price sort of combination you feel comfortable with?
Yeah, I haven't really started to really build rosters. Well, when I did start on FanDuel, I started with Wendell Smallwood and Devontae Booker. So I'm a little sad that now I kind of have to start from scratch. And I actually wrote up Booker, and so that was tough too. It always hurts when you see like 10, 15 minutes worth of work just go down the drain like that. So anyways. But Wendell Smallwood's top play for me. It's not even close, really. Kansas is allowing 255 yards per game on the ground, 5.5 yards per carry. Russell Shell will be there to steal away carries, but I think they both could have really good games. And Smallwood's only 7,600 on FanDuel. I really don't know how a smart player would not start with Smallwood, especially in cash lineups. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to reach in this situation. So he's where I would start. I like Anthony Wells against FIU. They're allowing 178 yards per game on the ground. I like him. I think he reminds me a lot of Leon Allen. He kind of fulfills that role quite nicely. They have Furby to steal away goal line carries, but it hasn't really hurt him yet. I think it could here. Just all depends on how the way they move the ball and things like that. Jordan Howard, I'm totally with Joe on that. Jordan Howard's unstoppable. We're talking about a guy who went up against Michigan and Iowa and ripped them to shreds.
Iowa, man.
Ripped them to shreds. Like, made them embarrassed. And these are teams that give up like 3 yards per carry. Like the top 10 run defenses in all of college football. So Jordan Howard at any price is like electric right now, and he's getting so many carries. He's so awesome. The only reason I had Booker ahead of him going into before we found out about Booker was because Booker gets 30-something carries and has actually a little bit better matchup. Farrow, we talked about. I love the Iowa running backs, but good luck if you want to try to figure out who the guy is going to be the star. Purdue is giving up 209.6 yards per game and 5.1 yards per carry. So you're dealing with get Wadley out of your brain. It's going to be Kanzeri and Daniels. Daniels is going to start. You know he is because he rushed for 196 yards and 3 touchdowns last week. Then you have Kanzeri there, who was actually the better back before he went down with the injury. But they like to ride the hot hand. I bet Daniels outdoes Kanzeri and carry. I feel like I'm getting an amen from the congregation. Did you feel that? I got like pumped up. It makes me want to keep going. But anyway, so yeah. So like I like Daniels as the guy to get the carries. I like him better as a DraftKings play where he's 5,400. We talked about the value of those kind of backs. The 5,400 running back is like very valuable. The only problem is I prefer them to be more like a DeAndre Washington type where I know they're the feature back. I think Daniels gets enough carries and does enough work that he's fine, but Kanzeri scares me. He just does, and then we're not going to get around it. Ronald Jones, great. Demario Richard, great. Alex Gardner for FIU is the sneaky play for DraftKings because he's only 4,700 and has huge reception upside that like not a whole lot of running backs have. He has 50 catches on the year for 401 yards. Only like 3 or 4 running backs have better reception numbers. So Western Kentucky's run defense isn't very good either. And then we talked about all the cheap guys. I would agree with the Marcus Allen play for Georgia Tech. I tweeted at one of their beat writers, and I knew he would get back to me quick. He's not like one of their main beat writers. And he said that he would not be shocked if Marcus Allen starts. I actually would not be shocked if Marcus Marshall starts. And the reason why I say that is because Marshall's a freshman. Georgia Tech has nothing to play for. Zero. Zilch. Nothing. And so you're talking about a team. They started Allen last week because they didn't like the way Marshall was fumbling the ball. But Marshall has 7.8 yards per carry. He's the dynamic back. He's the star freshman. He's the future B-back. Allen is a junior. He'll be back next year. So I don't know how they're going to quite function in this game against the Miami defense is just horrendous against the rush. I actually think Miami beats Georgia Tech, but they're giving up 202 yards per game on the ground. So to look at a B-back as a punt, I think Allen's 3K, Marcus Marshall's 3.3K on DraftKings, so both really super cheap dudes. Marshall, for me, is the bigger upside play. I think Allen might actually be the safer play and probably is the likely one to start. If you find this information, if you see it and they release that Georgia Tech is saying Marcus Allen is starting, please tweet me. Please let me know because I've been obsessing about this for a couple days and I can't figure it out. So definitely take a look. And I'd add Keon Kenner to the list of cheap running backs that we talked about. He's only available on FanDuel.
So much content there from both you and Joe, and I know the write-up is still ongoing, so we'll see that tomorrow. There is a lot to deal with when it comes to this point in the season with injuries and roster shakeups, and as we talked about, the beauty of the depth chart changes as we look towards next year and whether or not teams are going to have bowl practice to evaluate talent more and all those things play into these final couple of weeks of the college football season. So to everybody listening or viewing here, get on Twitter, get on the CFF site, get on these news sites that give you the updates, and you will be that much better off for it as you roll into Saturday morning. That's for the whole season, but as we get towards the end, it becomes more and more prevalent. Ben, let's look at wide receivers here, and you mentioned a few already throughout the discussion of guys you think might have big days, and you have Aaron Burbridge against Ohio State. Now, this is a contest that we know is a major one in the Big Ten. We can go through the narratives of it all, but Burbridge is a talent amongst some great wide receivers in the country right now. Do you have concern enough about Connor Cook that Burbridge takes a back seat in your research, or do you think this is a decent enough matchup for Burbridge to at least be part of the talking points as we get into wide receiver conversation here?
Yeah, I don't like targeting Ohio State. I actually have a very high opinion of their defense, even though we had somebody mention that they're a fake good defense, and they're okay. But they're okay enough to where I'm not like going all out over Burbridge, especially because what I saw when Cook went down, he was non-existent. Although I think Cook has already gone out and said that he's going to play in this game, so I'm not really worried about that. But Burbridge is not necessarily a guy I'm looking at. I'd rather go with a hurt Juju Smith against Oregon, who's like number 2 in the country and allowing passing touchdowns. So for me, that's a guy I'm looking at. I love Jordan Payton. He's going to have those wide receivers back, but he did last week, and he still was heavily focused in the pass game. Tywan Taylor for Western Kentucky has been amazing, except for like 2 games that he was non-existent. And you're always going to run that risk with the Western Kentucky wide receivers. If you're going to use a Western Kentucky guy in the passing game, for me, it's Tywan Taylor over all the other options, over Doty, over Dangerfield, over Norris, over all the other dudes. It's Tywan Taylor, and he's more expensive, so it makes sense. Carrington. Now, we'll break it up. I'm not going to go into all of these guys. So Carrington is one of those guys that I have to be honest, I didn't know a whole lot about going into this year, other than what I've seen in these last like 4 starts he's had. He's been amazing. He's been so good. So Joe, like before we started the year, I mean, I know he missed the first bunch of games. I don't know if it was due to injury. I guess it was injury. But like, where did this guy come from? Do you know? I mean, like,
no, I mean, look, he crept up on me too. I mean, but that's why I like Vernon Adams this week. I mean, between he and Braylon Addison, I think they've got 2 really good weapons there on the outside. So I think Adams is an intriguing option. But look, Carrington came out of nowhere for us as well. I mean, it was just a waiver wire pickup a couple of weeks ago, and I mean, he's just been rock solid.
Which has been a big point of frustration for Oregon, is having that wide receiver. I mean, Braylon Addison's awesome, but coming back from that injury, he hasn't really been what he was in that glimpse with Mariota a couple of years ago where he was just unstoppable. And Carrington looks like he's that guy now. And he's heavily targeted. Yep. He's definitely a guy that's going to be unstoppable for them in this game. And USC is a defense that can be beat. It's not necessarily a bad defense, though.
Carrington was suspended at the end of the season last year, and seeing chat there saying suspended at the beginning. Look, I know I'd read something on this because the use of the term street drug in the NCAA's rule book. I remember reading about this last year, why the suspension came around, and I just love the way lawyers write up things.
What's a street drug?
I think in this, it was just marijuana. Like it was so, but it's deemed.
We call marijuana a street drug.
Hey, it's the gateway drug, Ben.
For me, a street drug is like cocaine or crack. That's the 3rd mention of crack on this show. Yes.
We branded for life. So wide receiver typically, especially on DraftKings, can be one that makes or breaks your lineup if you find the cheap guy. I know a lot of us chased Sills from West Virginia a good deal the past few weeks, trying to get him into our lineups, and that burned you at points. Where are you guys going middle tier, Ben, lower tier to find these guys who can fill out your roster lineup and give you some at least higher upside as compared to some of their comparable price points?
I think FanDuel has just given up on pricing wide receivers correctly. And I'm fine with it, but it does make it difficult when you're making your lineups to zone in on like the guy. And so like we mentioned in chat, somebody mentioned about do you like Ventel Bryant or Robbie Anderson in the Temple versus Memphis game, which is available on both sites remarkably. I don't know. It's going to depend on price, and with Robbie Anderson 5,700 and Ventel Bryant only 5,100 on FanDuel, and they're actually similarly priced on DraftKings. That's a tough game. That's a tough matchup. I mean, Ventel Bryant's been more targeted in the last 3 games, but Anderson is the guy, and he's the big play guy. I think as people have started to focus on Anderson, it's opened up Bryant. As teams start recognizing Bryant, and Memphis is terrible against pass, so that could open up Anderson, and I think Anderson's the better touchdown play. Thomas is great. Duarte for UCLA, Severin for Virginia. If Duke keeps playing like they're playing against the pass, the guy had 3 touchdowns last week. He's a touchdown beast that hasn't really gotten his chance because of inconsistent play for Matt Johns at quarterback. So I would not be shocked one bit to see Severin have another nice game. He's only 5,700 on FanDuel, not available on DraftKings, unfortunately. Cheap plays. I really like the Arizona State duo that are actually, they're cheap on FanDuel. They're not cheap on DraftKings, but they're 5,100 and 4,900 on FanDuel. That's DJ Foster and Tim White. And this is where I get a little maybe off the reservation a little bit. I think Braxton Miller in the senior game goes a little ham. Yeah, he's a senior. They're going to give him shots. I don't know. He gets more touches when he's playing at home. It's like 3-1 more touches when he's playing at home than when he's playing on the road. He hasn't been effective. He really hasn't since the very first game of the season. So it's a long shot play, but he's a minimum price play. So it's not like you're risking a whole lot if you're looking to punt. But the problem with that, and this is why he's going to be ranked low when you look at my rankings, Shelton Gibson, Artavis Scott, and like Trayvon Durrell are all guys that are pretty much the same price at just over $5K. And they're all more established, more consistent receivers, and so it makes me a little nervous to do that. I like Cobbs and Owens and Taylor from FIU against Western. Those are all decent options for me as well.
Joe, how about yourself in this?
Yeah, one thing. Well, look, one name that we have mentioned, we talk about how consistency at wide receiver all year, whether you're playing season long or DFS is really the main thing. We've talked about the top guys all season long. I couldn't agree with Ben more. Taiwan Taylor over at Western Kentucky. I don't know how you don't take him as one of your top options, but if we're looking at some of the value plays, you have to look at consistency. We've talked about Calvin Ridley all year, and I'll go back to another name that I've mentioned all year as well, Malachi Dupree, right, for LSU. With DraftKings, he's 4,300. I mean, look, guys, he's gone in 4 of the last 5 games. He's had 17-plus fantasy points. In 4 of the last 5 games, that's probably better than Calvin Ridley. So the only game he never was the game against Alabama, was a game that we've never really even recommended playing him anyway. But you're still getting good value. And I think as far as value goes, we talked about Deion Kane last week for Clemson, right? He's got 14-plus fantasy points in 3 straight games and in 4 or 5. So if you're looking to jump on some of these value plays, I think that would be one right there. You got to look at also Jehu Chesson over at Michigan, who's gone over 20 fantasy points in 3 of the last 6. It could be a little boom or bust. They play Penn State, but man, he's gone over 20 fantasy points in 3 of 6. And then, you got Sharon Peake over there at Clemson that just came off of a monster game. Clemson's got another weak opponent this week. And then I'll throw another name for you out there as well, who's 3,700 on DraftKings. That could be an interesting play. Could be Simi Cobb of Indiana. I know they're riding Jordan Howard, but I think for 3,700, Simi Cobb's worth a play over there at Indiana with Nate Sudfeld. And then if you look at FanDuel, I've got Addison at 5,400. I've got Peake written down as well, and I've got Deion Kane as well. But one name I'll throw, and this brings us back to the beginning of the show when we're talking about what's going on with the Houston quarterback. Remember last week now when Greg Ward went out and Pulsma came in, guess who finished with 13 receptions? DeMarcus Ayers over there at Houston. So I think his value actually goes up as well if Greg Ward takes a seat on Saturday.
We'll have the start sit coming up in a little bit. We'll talk a tiny bit about the late slate. As always, Ben's write-up will be available on the Fantasy Insiders later on Friday for the late slate or Saturday morning for you to dive into after you set your early lineups. You can maybe start telking pretty early if you so choose to get into the late slate of
They're
games.
not going to be they're not going to be
I was going to correct myself. I was segueing for myself that of
That was
course
not a good
you
segue.
don't tell. Of course you don't tell with college football, and we talk about it all the time between Ben and Fear My Turtle at Fantasy Insiders, two really great content pieces every week, and I know FMT has been pumping out even more content as Maction has picked up the past few weeks, and there have been more and more Tuesday, Wednesday slates for college football as well. Ben, we've touched on quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers. Tight end is left here in this early slate. Are we punting at the position? Is there a 2K guy? Trying to talk too fast here. A 2K guy who you can fit into your lineup, or do you see paying up for Jake Butt or Leggett or somebody who you can trust a little bit more?
I don't really care about tight ends anymore, man. Like for me, I actually want to leave one of the guys that I found. I'm going to leave him for the write-up, so you have to look at the write-up who I really, really like. But I think Bucky Hodges is in a good spot. We're talking about a North Carolina pass defense that is unbelievably improved. Like, they're so good as of late. But I think Hodges can present a little bit of a mismatch problem, and he gets a lot of targets with Brewer under center. So I like him in this home matchup as a guy that's kind of only 3,600, decent. I'm going to let Joe talk about Leggett because he talks about him every week, so I'll let him talk about him. But Fumagalli I like a lot for Wisconsin at only 2,500 against Northwestern. Not necessarily a game you want to go all out in targeting because both defenses are pretty stout. But Fumagalli, if he gets the targets, could have a nice little day for that price. And then there's two other cheap guys that are more punt level that you'll have to read the write-up to see.
Joe, Leggett?
How about this? How about I punt? How about I punt to Ben's write-up so we can get into the late slate? Let's just forget about the tight end, all right?
Sounds good. So, Joe, why don't you kick us off on this late slate of games? Who you're at least paying attention to, who you think are some core plays at each position, just across quarterback, running back, and wide receiver, guys that you're going to look to at least have in roster construction.
You know what? Look, I'm just going to throw out. I'm going to toss a lot to Ben here for the late slate. I'm just going to throw out a few names for you. I love the fact that we get Keenan Reynolds on FanDuel at 8,600. I still like Jarrett Stidham at Baylor. I know last week I threw him out and we burned. I still like him for 7,100 on DraftKings and 8,500 on FanDuel. And you know what? I think as far as a value play goes, I even think somebody like Brandon Allen for Arkansas at 5,300 against Mississippi State would be a nice play. Running backs, you got P. Ryan at 6,800, Chris Swain if we're staying in that Navy game as well. I think Vic Enware for Cal at 3,800 is an extremely valuable play considering that Lasco and Khalif Muhammad could be – they're facing question marks with injuries right now. So, and the other name I'll throw out is just Sean Nixon, who's running back / wide receiver now at TCU. If Boykin does play, to get him at 4,700 on DraftKings, I think is tremendous value. Fred Ross, 4,600 for Mississippi State, I think is tremendous value. And a guy that's had a lot of production in the last few weeks without a lot of touches is a guy like Dominic Reed at 3,800 for Arkansas playing Mississippi State. And I mentioned Teddy Veal for Tulane before, and I'll throw him out at 4,100 against SMU. And I'll leave a lot of this slate to Ben, but that's just a few of the value plays here in the late slate for me.
All right, I'm going to leave a lot of this slate to Dan.
Great.
Go, Dan.
Let's do it. Let's jump right into it.
We
up finally.
You got the call up. Let's see what you got, man. No, seriously though, Keenan Reynolds, we talked about him last week. Boy, were we right about that narrative. Good Lord. The guy had 4 rushing touchdowns and threw for another one. I mean, he was amazing. Another really good matchup. He's priced a lot more expensively this week because sites haven't lost their mind. Tulsa's really bad against the run. So if you want to fade Reynolds with Swain, that's a smart way to do it. If you're going to run Reynolds, he is more expensive. He is more priced correctly. So if you run him, he's still a great play, still a really good play, but he's not quite the lock that he was last week. I mean, he was a lock for me last week. So So definitely a guy I'm looking at. Let me pull this up. Keenan Luke Falk. Love me some Luke Falk against Colorado at home. Golly, I wish this game, and it makes no sense to me. And let's get on a little soapbox real quick before we'll just go over these plays quickly because they need to read the write-ups anyways. Why in the world did FanDuel not include all these juicy games like Cal, Stanford, Colorado, Washington State? Makes no sense to me why they didn't include those. I understand not including Tulane and SMU, not including San Jose, Hawaii, and San Diego State, UNLV. I get it. But Cal, Stanford, and Colorado, Washington State, there's no excuses for that. Those are games that should be on the FanDuel slate, and especially when you're only pumping out like 7 or 8 games, makes no sense to me. Because that makes it harder for somebody who's looking at the slate and for me writing it up. When I look at your crappy slate and I have to put it up against DraftKings' decent slate and I have to kind of build a write-up with plays for both, it makes it really hard for me. And we talked about this last week. And like I was able to cater the write-up, and the write-up built itself for DraftKings. And people that played DraftKings last week did really well. I think I sucked against FanDuel in the write-up, and that was because of the way we had to build it. And if FanDuel would just kind of just be decent, we would be fine. And it blows my mind because FanDuel last year was the site for late slate because they were all on these Mountain West games. They were all on these fun games that we all want to play. And it made it great. It made it very profitable for people that did their homework. And now that's DraftKings. So if you want to play the slate that's more profitable for a guy who does research and for a guy who works hard, it's going to be DraftKings on this slate. You don't want to do FanDuel. You've just got surface level games. But yet they did include the Georgia Southern game, which is remarkably on both sites. I think I've said remarkably about 10 times tonight. But Georgia Southern is a game that I don't understand why that one's in. But if it is, Sony Michel is a great play. Love him in this matchup, even with a broken hand. Really good, really good play as a running back. Staying with the running backs, let's go back to DraftKings. Tyler Ervin, who I know your boy over here, Joe, is in love with this guy, and he should be because he has been one of the best fantasy running backs in all of college football. Definitely a good play in this game against a bad UNLV run defense. Joe, I don't know. What do you think about that? What do you think Tyler Ervin is kind of the guy you need to start with? I'm sorry, against Hawaii. I said UNLV, but Hawaii, who is allowing like 200 and something yards per game against running backs.
The only thing I'll caution people with Tyler Ervin is he hasn't been what he was the first third of the season, and you're seeing a lot coming from the quarterback position. Now, I actually think the quarterback for San Jose State is a great play this week. He had a monster week last week, so that's a little something to be cautioned about that as well. But I do like the mention of Sony Michel at 6,600, and I even like Ralph Webb Vanderbilt at 6,200 for going against A&M.
Okay, so I set Joe up a little bit there because I think that you can pencil in Tyler Ervin for 200 yards in this game. I really do. I think he's going to get back to one of the – I mean, you're talking about a guy who had 260 yards against New Mexico. He had 300 yards against Fresno this season. Now, he has had those bad games. He had a bad game showing against BYU, Nevada, San Diego State. But all those defenses are pretty bad – are pretty decent run defenses and not good matchups. So I would not be surprised to see him go back to being awesome if it's just for one more game. And we end the season on a nice little high note for him. And he does have that pass catching ability where he could be good there too. I like him. I like Webb. Like he mentioned, Paul Harris has a good matchup. Russell Hansbrough has a decent matchup against Tennessee. He's decently priced too. Both the Tulsa running backs have been very good. Langer, I doubt they even put Langer in, but Navy's defense as a whole has been strong. But with the way that Tulsa plays, I think that there's opportunities for both Brewer and Warren to provide value for how cheap they are. Chase Price, who we repped last week, especially in the write-up, and I basically called him a must-play on DraftKings, was insanely good last week. I mean, 2 touchdowns, rushed for over like 170 yards. Not necessarily – you can't expect that again this week, but as a backup running back. But he has a similarly good matchup where they're going to pound the rock against a UNLV defense that is going to struggle against San Diego State. So I like him a lot. Getting more cheaper plays. Swain is actually really cheap on FanDuel at 5,900. Lindsey's cheap for Colorado. it's a decent matchup for him against Washington State. Wide receivers, Sutton for SMU, only available on DraftKings against Tulane, is a decent one. We always know about Corey Coleman, Gabe Marks, James Washington. Those are the guys you know. Those are the guys that are going to be good guys to build around. Drew Morgan is really cheap. Fred Ross, who he mentioned, Dominic Reed. A lot of the guys, again, on FanDuel are insanely underpriced. It's like they have some guys that are Corey Coleman's 8,700. Well, you go like 10 guys down and you're dealing with Reed and Ross that are 5,400 and 5,600. That's way too big of a drop off for such a small slate. So like if you fade Coleman and you have these cheap wide receivers, it's going to be either boom or bust. It's just the way it's going to be. And just roster building construction, it's going to be difficult. It's more of a GPP slate for FanDuel.
Great stuff, guys. As always, we're going to get to Joe's start sit in just a moment. Coming up after that, we'll get Ben's hot take of the week. And then, again, a programming note, next week we'll not have the college football spreecast. We'll be back with you the following week to start to close out the year as we look towards bowl games and all that fun jazz in December. All 41 of them, Ben. We have to get ready for those as we close out the year. But, Joe, the floor is yours for your start sit for Week 12 of the college football season.
Yeah, guys, look, first of all, a lot of thanks to you guys over at Fantasy Insiders. I mean, what a pleasure to be working with you guys. A lot of all season long guys. Hopefully they don't fall off and they join us, throughout the bowl season as well. I just want to say a lot of thanks to you guys that have watched, and for those that jumped on our preseason draft guide, thank you for the support. We do have a bowl season fantasy guide. We hope you guys continue to support that as well. We'll pick up after the holidays, but look, it's the money week, guys, right? Semifinals. I call it the money week because if you're in the championship, you're making money anyway, and usually the championship week is for bragging rights. But this is the week right here where we call it the money week. It's the semifinals week to get into finals. And you know what? Mark Twain once said, if you want me to give you a 2-hour presentation, I'm ready to go right now. But if you want me to give you a 5-minute speech, I need 2 weeks to prepare. Well, guys, we got a 5-minute speech for you right here, but we only need 1 week to prepare. We did that for you right here. Week 12, start bench. We're going to get started. So here we go, guys. There's a theme this week to the bench now, okay? And we're going to get to that theme in a minute. But we're going to start with the solo guys, the guys that we think should be on the bench. Justin Jackson, running back, Northwestern, playing at Wisconsin. Justin Jackson is just going against a solid defense in Wisconsin. I don't really know how much offense that Northwestern can produce right now going on the road to Wisconsin. Jackson's probably going to get a heavy dose, but I don't think he's going to be able to pile on the yardage. And I don't even know if he's going to be able to find the end zone this week. I like Justin Jackson, the bench, Week 12 at Wisconsin. Jacoby Owens, running back Air Force. He's a guy that we recommended starting a couple of weeks ago. He has scored in 4 of the Falcons' previous 5 games, but he's only combined for 25 carries in the past 2 games. And in Week 11, 5 players had at least 9 rushing attempts on the Falcons roster. Owens did lead the way with 17 in a 35-28 win over Utah State. But in Week 12, the Falcons traveled to Boise in a Friday night game and faced one of the nation's best rushing defenses. The Broncos are allowing fewer than 95 rushing yards per game, and we think with too many carries being spread out, Jacoby Owens should be a Week 12 bench. And here's the theme, guys, this week. We got a lot of guys, multiple guys on the same team that we're going to recommend benching. Here's the first one. Joshua Dobbs, quarterback Tennessee, and Jalen Hurd, running back Tennessee, playing at Missouri. When Tennessee visits Missouri this weekend, the Vols will face an inspired team looking to send out head coach Gary Pinkel, a winner in his final home game. The Tigers are only allowing 113 rushing yards per game on top of that momentum that they probably have in the inspiration, and that's 15th best in the FBS. And they're only one of 6 teams in the country to allow 6 or fewer rushing touchdowns. It's not to say one of these guys are not going to do well, but good luck picking them out. We're going to say leave them both on the bench this week. Week 12 bench, Joshua Dobbs and Jalen Hurd at Missouri. Another duo, Anthony Taylor, running back, Jordan Johnson, running back, Buffalo. Both of them Buffalo running backs playing at Akron this week, and this is for you season-long guys. We expect Taylor and Johnson to split carries when the Bulls travel to Akron on Saturday, which means that neither may be productive enough to start in Week 12 against the Zips, who currently have the nation's 3rd best rush defense statistically against the run. They're allowing fewer than 100 rushing yards per game, 94 yards per game. Once again, one of these guys may do well, one may not. Good luck picking them. We're going to say bench them both take a safer option elsewhere on your roster. And here we go to a more high-profile game. Running back C.J. Prosise and Josh Adams, running backs Notre Dame, play in Boston College. Look, Notre Dame's got a great matchup at home playing against Boston College. Prosise is expected to make his return this week, but given Adams' production in the past 2 games, we're expecting a split in carries this Saturday when Boston College goes to South Bend. And we just can't expect Prosise to jump in and get 25 carries in his first game back after missing a couple. And, the Eagles currently have the nation's top rushing defense. They're only allowing 71 yards per game on the ground. I don't know if that holds a lot of water in South Bend, but they're still solid enough to know that if these guys split carries, I don't know which one's going to have the better game. Good luck again. We think you're safe for putting C.J. Prosise and Josh Adams on a bench against a defense that's only allowed 5 rushing touchdowns this season. I don't know how you favor one or the other. Bench both of them. And now we're going to get into the starts. Week 12. Here we go, guys. We're going to start with Sean Nixon, right? Running back TCU. TCU, whether they have Trevone Boykin or not, seems to be going to this short passing game, and Sean Nixon seems to be the benefactor of that. As Josh Doxson has been sidelined with a wrist injury, Nixon has thrived. The past 2 games, catching 16 passes for 224 yards and a touchdown, which has been better than both Colby Listenby and Kevontae Turpin. Nixon is a risky start if quarterback Trevone Boykin doesn't play, but if he does play, get Nixon in your lineup for Week 12, guys. He's a must start. Jeremy Cox, running back Old Dominion. This is for your season-long guys playing at Southern Miss. We got news early in the week that Ray Lowry was out, which was good news for guys that picked up Cox off the waiver wire Monday for those fantasy owners that were able to grab him. And you know what? The freshman back, he's averaged 5.5 yards per carry this season in limited duty as Lowry's backup. We think he's got a good matchup to produce for you in Week 12. We think you got to get him in as a start this week. Quentin Flowers, quarterback South Florida, Ben, the guys that you and I have touched on several times throughout the course of the year. Not only has Flowers passed for 200 or more yards in 3 consecutive games, but he has rushed for at least 79 yards in 4 of his last 5. Well, this week he'll face a Cincinnati defense that has given up over 185 yards per game on the ground. We think Quentin Flowers is going to do it on the ground and in the air again. Get him in your Week 12 lineup. We like him this week as a start at home against Cincinnati. Kyle Postma, quarterback Houston at Connecticut. Now, a lot depends on whether or not Greg Ward is going to play on Saturday. But if he doesn't, fantasy owners shouldn't hesitate putting Postma into their starting lineups. Last week against Memphis, the sophomore quarterback, he was sensational in leading the Cougars back to a 35-34 win over Memphis. He passed for 236 yards. He added 49 yards on the ground. He accounted for 2 touchdowns, 1 passing, 1 rushing. If Greg Ward does not play, get Kyle Postma in your lineups for Week 12, guys. And then here's another questionable play. We've got a lot of emails on this week, and we got 2 names left, and this is one. Saquon Barkley, running back Penn State versus Michigan. Jordan Howard carved him up last week, and Barkley's been more effective recently as he's been utilized in the passing game in the Penn State's last 2 games. He's posted at least 50 receiving yards in back-to-back games, and this week he faces a Michigan defense looking to bounce back from poor performance against Indiana, like I mentioned in Week 11. The freshman back may not be a great play as a running back 1 or running back 2 this week, but don't hesitate to put him in as a flex option to get you to the championship game. Saquon Barkley, Week 12 start at home against Michigan. And then the last start of the week we'll recommend. We talked about him. I talked about him a little earlier. Perry Hills, quarterback Maryland, playing against Indiana. After rushing for 100 yards in 3 consecutive games, Hill struggled in back-to-back games against Wisconsin and Michigan State. Well, a Week 12 matchup against Indiana at home is just what he needs to get on track. The Hoosiers are allowing over 170 yards per game on the ground. They're allowing 38 points per game and 511 total yards per game, which is amongst the 10 worst teams in the FBS. Perry Hills guy, Week 12. Get him in your lineup. He's a start versus Indiana this week. Good luck, guys.
Great stuff, Joe, as always. We are going to close out with Ben's hot take, but also, Ben, plenty of news going around and nothing definitive as of right now about the industry at large. What are some of your thoughts as we go through college football Week 12 and where we stand? And we'll close out with your hot take so we end on the uptick rather than this discussion point. But where do you stand on everything going on right now?
So everybody who plays daily fantasy should be aware of the situation surrounding daily fantasy the legality and the nature of the industry as a whole and how it translates from state to state and all the news that's going down. I mean, you need to be focused on it because it affects everybody. It affects us as a business. It affects you as a player. And it's important. And we live in America. We live in a country that we should be allowed to do the things that we want to do with our money and play the things that we want to play and the games that we want to play. And I have a very I don't know how to best put it, but it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me just being an owner in this company and playing fantasy sports my whole life. I don't quite understand how somebody can come in and tell me what I can and can't do and what I can and can't control. But furthermore, I think the Massachusetts Attorney General did a really good job of laying out a regulatory way of handling things, and I'm afraid that it's going to actually be the standard for the entire industry, which is probably a good thing for the whole. But she did add the caveat about college sports and how she doesn't like it and she doesn't think that there should be daily fantasy on college sports, which I totally disagree with. But as we enter an unknown world of legality, I would rather her rule in favor of the legalization of daily fantasy as a whole than necessarily worry about my and Joe and all of our success as college sports analysts and things like that. But yes, it's going to affect us. It'll affect you as a player because I know that I've asked this question in the forum before is daily fantasy, what is your main sport that you make the most money at? Time and time again, it came back college football. It can come back college basketball just as easily if you're using Fear My Turtles write-ups and Jordan's write-ups. And so it's tough when you have a sport that's so profitable and so alluring and fun, and it's the best. So it's tough to watch this love be under scrutiny. And definitely as we enter the final weeks and as we enter this 41-game bowl game schedule, focus on having fun and getting as much use that you can and cherish it, and maybe take a guy and find one of the FI writers that maybe you haven't thanked, like Jordan or one of the other guys, and just say, hey, you do a great job, and hopefully we'll be able to do this again next year. But if not, I'll be an NFL writer, and Joe will go back to doing yearly stuff, and we'll find something else to come on here and talk about. I mean, we could talk about fashion or, I don't know, politics, something crazy.
Politics would go really well. That would go really, really well. We'll talk politics and religion moving forward. The big thing, Ben, I think you nailed it there. Hopefully there is some change to the regulations proposed. I know there's an open discussion for the next few weeks here in Massachusetts. So hopefully something good comes of that. It is, I'll say comical because I don't know another word, where I agree with the way Maura Healey said that, student athletes are student athletes. They're not there to have money made off of them when that's all the NCAA and these conferences do. And obviously they're two different things. I'm not comparing DFS to the NCAA, but it's just sort of that larger scale issue at hand of how college sports and mainly football and basketball are moneymakers for these universities and for these conferences and for the NCAA, but yet we hear things like, well, we shouldn't be making money off of these student athletes. We shouldn't be building fantasy lineups off these student athletes. And the big thing moving forward is how these stats are used, because I know that's been a statute in the past of whether or not simply the numbers that are produced and passed along to different sites are a problem, or is it the player's image and the player's name and that sort of thing. So hopefully cooler heads prevail, and it seems like we're heading in that direction. So we will keep you guys up to date. Ben has some great insight on it from a personal point of view and from a business point of view. So we'll bring you his opinion and the like as we move forward. So Ben, as I said, we got to leave on an up. We gotta keep the momentum going towards next week. Joe brought the goods with the start sit. The hot take of the week is whom?
I'm depressed now, Dan. I don't think I can do it. No, I like. I think it's going to go back to Smallwood, and here's my hot take on Smallwood. He's good. We all knew that. We've been touting Smallwood since the very first week. When I put in my template, which people will notice sometimes I accidentally don't quite fully proofread. So sometimes you have like Wendell Smallwood playing for TCU. Sorry about that, guys. It's something I try to fix, and I'll fix it if you bring it to my attention. But I have a template, and in my template, Wendell Smallwood is there as a cheap play, and it was him as a backup. And Joe's been a big fan. I've been a big fan. Fear My Turtle's been a huge fan, and we've used him a lot, and he's been worth it. Doesn't get a whole lot of touchdowns, but here's my hot take on him. I think he gets 200 yards rushing. That's the hot take, and he hasn't reached that mark yet this year. And even with Rush Rochelle there to still carries and make me lisp. I love Wendell Smallwood, and I think he gets a couple touchdowns too.
Great stuff, gentlemen. As always, find Joe over there at the CFF site, thecffsite.com, and on Twitter at the CFF site. Still the start sit released tonight here on the show, but available over on the site as well. Great stuff, Joe and Ben. The write-up's coming tomorrow and Saturday for the early and late slate each week. And as I mentioned, Jordan Case's dumpster diving is available over at fantasyinsiders.com. Enjoy Thanksgiving, everybody. Hope you guys have a great Thanksgiving next week. Joe, Ben, you guys, your family. Hope you guys enjoy the time there. And to everybody listening and watching, we wish you a happy Thanksgiving. And we'll see you on the other side of the brief holiday break for more college football and more here from fantasyinsiders.com.